Well, joining us now is Aglaya Snetkov. She is a lecturer at University College London and an author of a book on Russian security policy and Putin. Thanks for joining us. And since you've written about Putin, I'd like to ask you about what his ambitions could be. I mean, do you think he plans to take all of Ukraine, and does he have ambitions beyond Ukraine?
Thanks for having me on. I think in terms of ambitious, I mean, it's unprecedented. Everyone's been shocked at the war. The proclaimed ambition is to denazify Ukraine. At this stage, if we're looking at the military operations, they're going from the north, they're going from the east, they're going from the south. So the main focus is those areas going on to Kyiv. I think the assumption would be that once they get to Kyiv, and if they control it, that they would have a regime change. And there's a question, right? Are they happy with their regime change? The country becomes a friendly regime to Russia. Do they keep going? At this stage, there seems to be no plan to keep going beyond Ukraine. Regime change seems to be sufficient. But also there is a feeling that, Putin is sort of partly making it up as he goes along, right? There's a sort of one move towards the next move. So we don't know, if we have to be truthfully honest, right? We don't know what is the end goal beyond the ones that are stated at the moment, which is very much sort of taking control of Kyiv.
Is there a scenario in which, parts of Ukraine would remain independent, even if the Russians take over the capital of Kyiv?
So at this stage, I would definitely assume that if there's a regime change in Kyiv, that at least the western part of Ukraine, where at the moment there are no Russian troops, I would assume that they would at least continue resisting the assault of the Russian troops. I'm not sure the regime change in Kyiv would mean that the whole of Ukraine will sort of fall into the Russian lap, so to speak. It's not going to be the same as 2014, where, you had separatist republics in Donbass, and the rest of the country sort of remained more or less the same as a whole. I could very easily envisage a splitting of Ukraine in the case of sort of Russians taking over Kyiv.
Well, let's talk a bit about Russia's military strategy. I mean, why is Moscow targeting the southern part of the country, in particular Mariupol and Odessa, which could be the next target?
So it's an excellent question. I mean, at the beginning, before the invasion, the troops had been amassing for a long time. There was a discussion about whether or not Russians will go for that three-pronged approach, moving on to Kyiv. Now it seems the Russians are doing it. And so clearly they are trying to get the southern corridor, right? Crimea to the west and Crimea to the west. If they cut off Odessa, Kherson, Crimea, it means that Ukraine actually turns into a landlocked country. Lots of Ukrainian exports are coming down the south. There was also the discussion about whether they're trying to stretch out the Ukrainian forces, forcing them to also, fight in the south, pulling them away from Kyiv. That was the assumption strategically that that's what the Russians were doing. At the moment, the campaign is not going very well. So, this is not an altogether successful strategy, but it's clearly one that Russians are going for. There is the assumption that after Mariupol, they will carry on and they will be going on to Odessa in order to sort of create this sort of cutting Ukraine off from its basically controls of the sea.
Well, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken today, he outlined the possibility of sending fighter jets to Ukraine, although not directly. How would that work, and would it signal a wider escalation of the war?
So clearly, the Ukrainian leadership has been calling for a step up in NATO's involvement and support of Ukraine. They've been calling for more military assistance. NATO has not been willing to give the no-fly zone, clearly. So the solution seems to be at the moment that the US supplies Poland with F-16s, and Poland will then give over their sort of Soviet-made fighter jets over to the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians would be able to then operationalize the MiGs fighter jets to be able to fight against the Russians. The importance here is that it's hard to, send in fighter jets that essentially Ukrainian pilots have no experience in flying, right? You need a lot of training for that. So NATO troops can't simply send in Western-made fighter jets. Also, this way of sort of supplying Poland and Poland supplying Ukraine does mean that NATO countries are stepping out of being directly involved in the fight against the Russians, right? So NATO planes will still sort of not be directly fighting against the Russian troops, and it would be the Ukrainian fighters who will be operating those jets.
Okay, we want to thank you for your time, Aglaya Snetkov, lecturer at the University College of London and author of a book on Russian security, policy, and Putin. Sorry for mispronouncing your name there at the top.
That's fine.
Thanks for joining
Thanks
us.
for having me on. Thanks.